I mean, my book is based on what took place in November 1984. So the events following Mrs. Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister's assassination by her two Sikh bodyguards. Men, women and children being killed. Many women and girls were killed, and there was mass rape on an unprecedented scale.
Eyewitness testimony can pick out senior politicians that were present. People like, I'm not sure if we're allowed to say the name, but Have you received any backlash or anything around what you've written and collated? Hello and welcome to another episode of Samosa Chats. My guest today is Pav Singh. He's the author of 1984, India's Guilty Secret, which basically documents the events around the Punjabi or Sikh genocide at the time after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, who was India's sitting Prime Minister. Hello, Pav. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Preet? Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So the book, do you have a copy of it with you? Me being the great host I am, I didn't actually have it to hand.
I do indeed.
If you wouldn't mind holding it up, yeah, that's perfect. So 1984, India's Guilty Secret. When did the book first launch? So
it got published 3 years ago. In fact, it was launched in the House of Lords. And then it got launched in India. So I have a publisher in India, Rupa Publications, who launched it and published it in India as well. And then the ebook came out last year, again published by Kashi House, which is a UK publisher.
How did if we go back a little bit, so what are your sort of experiences with the events around 1984? I guess some of our listeners may not actually know, but if you had to sort of succinctly put down what 1984 was, how would you describe what happened and what we refer to when we refer to 1984?
I mean, my book is based on what took place in November 1984. So the events following Mrs. Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister's assassination by her two Sikh bodyguards, and the events for the next 3-4 days. And then subsequent 2 or 3 decades of cover-up as well. But yeah, the event I describe as genocide, the 1984 Sikh genocide. In my mind, were a series of genocidal massacres, pogroms, mass rapes that took place. It's very different from the way it's framed officially by not only the Indian government, the Congress Party in particular, but also academics and Indian media still frame it as a communal riot or an anti-sikh riot. So I think that's one thing that gave me real good reasons to look at the events and try and challenge the narrative behind what took place. Because it's been very quite dangerous that it was framed as a riot, because it minimized what took place, it kind of mischaracterized the events and the crimes that took place by just calling it a communal riot. And here we are 3 decades on, and no justice has been given to the victims, and they've been fighting most of the time by themselves. Widows and orphans. We have a widows colony in Delhi. I mean, how shameful that is for in the world's largest democracy to have a widows colony right in the center of the country, of the capital. And it's an event that many still don't like to talk about. They brush it aside. There's a real silence still in India. And if they do talk about it, again, it's about riots, and it's about also Khalistan and secessionists as well. So there's a real kind of feeling still that Sikhs had it coming to them.
Yeah.
So, for killing Mrs. Gandhi, 2 Sikhs killed Mrs. Gandhi, and for that act, the whole Sikh community were targeted, and resulting in at least 8,000 Sikhs, men, women, and children, being killed. Many women and girls were killed, and there was mass rape on a unprecedented scale.
Mm.
So it's lots of the kind of gigantic magnitude of the events have never been recognized, both by the state or by the media. And there was a few mistakes that were made even by human rights groups early on, by also framing it as a riot. So I think, me living sort of in the UK, being brought up in the West with sort of the Holocaust and other genocides, having a shadow on the events in the West, I could have that distance from the events and look at it, compare it with other genocides, smaller genocides, not particularly the Holocaust, but in comparison, the genocide of Srebrenica, where 8,000 Muslims, men and boys, were killed. So that's the sort of comparison I would make.
So if we were to take a step back, so Indira Gandhi gets assassinated in November of '84, and that was at a time a retaliation for the sort of storming, shelling, bombing, whatever you like to call it, of Darbar Sahib, or the Golden Temple. What was the politics at play at the time? Just a brief overview of what that event actually was. So in June, in June of
Yeah,
'84.
so it's very important to go back to June, and even before that. Now, India is a majority Hindu country. 80% are Hindus. And there was a small clique of people around Mrs. Gandhi who, early on in the 80s, decided the only way they could get back, cling on to power, and we had elections coming up in 1984, was to play the communal card. And they decided to target Sikhs, other Sikhs, as a minority, as a anti-national, secessionist community. And that small group of people, sort of directed events really from the 80s onwards. They encouraged communalism in Punjab. They had no interest in resolving the issue of Punjab. So there was quite a large civil rights movement that was going on in Punjab, very similar to what's happening now with the farmers' protests. So you had farmers' issues regarding water rights, rights of power, and also, demands to get a capital city for Punjab. Then and even now, it's shared with the neighbouring state of Haryana. Many other issues were raised, more rights to Punjab in terms of centre-state relations, a more federal solution that was sought. And it really goes back to 1947, even before that, before independence, where Sikhs were promised by the Congress Party that they would be able to enjoy a glow of freedom in their own state within India. So it was more of a federal state that India would be. But then, after independence, Congress renegated on those promises, and India became more centralized. Less power was given to the individual states, and that sort of explains why '84 took place, and also why we have the problems today, where the centre is bent on bringing privatization into Punjab, and so on. So it really goes back to those events before 1984, and it culminated with June 1984, when I think Sikhs in general were cornered. There was no negotiation, settlement. There were communal forces in Punjab that were encouraged. There were a concerted effort to cause problems between Sikhs and Hindus in Punjab. There were, attacks on innocent Hindus. Hindus were taken off buses and shot. And then on the other side, there were, torture employed by the Punjab police on innocent Sikhs as well. So it really created this kind of a situation where the government said, well, actually, it's gone out of control. They are terrorists now, taken over the Golden Temple. We've got no choice but to go in and take that, when there were so many options to have a peaceful solution. If there was a handful of so-called terrorist militants who were in there, they could have been starved out. They could have been, it could have been taken out by snipers. The press could have been invited, and the militants could have come out, and it could be really peaceful. And in fact, in a few years after that, Black Thunder, that there was a peaceful, solution to what took place in 1987. So all those efforts, the Indian government decided not to do, and they sent in the cavalry, the battalions, the tanks, and not only that, but on the busiest day in the Sikh calendar, the martyrdom of Guru Arjan Dev Ji, where it was really busy, lots of farmers, lots of village people were in there, and the curfew was imposed, and basically it was a trap, and then a bloodbath, and many thousands of innocent pilgrims were killed, as well as many of the militants. And I think that caused so much anger in the community. And not only that, but they were kind of othered and framed as anti-national as well. The white paper of the Indian government came out, in July, basically saying that it was a secessionist movement that needed to be cut. It really caused so much problems, and within the general Hindu community, there was that feeling, swallowing the propaganda of the government, that Sikhs needed to be cut down to size, and they had it coming, and they needed to be taught a lesson. And November 1984 gave them that excuse. The 31st of October, assassination of Mrs. Gandhi was that time when the genocide was put in place. But the planning was put in place months before that.
Yeah, thanks for the summary and sort of setting the background to that. I guess we kind of have a similar sort of background, as in both of us are born and raised here, two immigrant parents from Punjab. Whenever I sort of like look at the events in June 1st, I always kind of think that there's so many factors that point to a different way of handling it. There could have been X number of different options to handle it. But then the thing that always is the clincher for me is the sort of destruction and devastation that was caused to the sort of primal Sikh sort of authority and Gurdwara, sort of, which is a symbol of just like Sikhism, really, isn't it? Like the destruction of artifacts, things like that. I think that's often missed in sort of the mainstream reporting of what took place. But going back to your background, so in 1984, you were here in the UK?
Yes, I was here. I mean, I was born in Leeds in Yorkshire, so I was brought up here. So I was a teenager in 1984. So I think that's probably a good way to understand why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
It's going back to the 31st of October, when I was getting ready for school, was in sixth form, and hearing of the events. My family was then quite worried, because I have family in Delhi, my aunts and uncle on my mum's side, and 4 cousins all live in Delhi. I mean, they luckily survived. They were taken in by their Hindu neighbors. Like so many Sikhs were saved by their fellow Indians, Hindus and Muslims and Christians. But it was through the family there and my visits to India, particularly in the last 2 decades, that I found the full extent of what took place. My uncle used to take me to the camps in Delhi, and I talked to many of the victims' families, and realized that actually the story had to be told, properly through the eyes of the victims. And so I used the testimonies, which were, submitted to the first inquiry and the second inquiry. The first inquiry, many of the testimonies weren't released for years, for decades actually. And it was through that I recognized and realized that actually the extent of the genocide, particularly the killings of the women and young girls, and then also the mass rape of women, which was hidden, and even now that officially those rapes have never been recognised, and the killings of children never been recognised. So it's why the book's called India's Guilty Secret. It is still a secret, the extent of a genocide. In our lifetime, that this genocide took place by a state. It wasn't just a political party, although the Congress Party was heavily involved. It was the administration, in terms of the cover-up, the judiciary, the police. The army was kept back for 3 days, and also ordinary Indians either took part in the killing, or they were indifferent and just watched what took place. And it's quite important, very very similar to what happened in Germany afterwards. It's quite important that for India to now look at itself in the mirror to see how the hell did this happen, and to a new generation of Indians to ask their mums and dads, their uncles and aunts, what did you do in 1984? Were you on the side of the Sikhs? Did you help Sikhs, or did you join in with the killing, or did you simply just watch? So it's very important questions, because only then that we can start talking about closure.
You mentioned there that the official story differs from research that you've conducted and other bodies have conducted as well. What sort of difference are we talking?
So starting off with actually the framing of what took place as a riot, it was the first thing that the new Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi uttered after the events, where he basically called what took place as communal riots, that were a spontaneous reaction to his mother's assassination. So no mention of it being organized, targeted, and no mention of the fact that his own henchmen were involved, and even a family member of his were directly one of the orchestrators of the massacres. No mention of the fact that he held the army back for 3 days until thousands had been killed. No mention of the fact that he promoted the very Congress leaders to high office and to cabinet post genocide, and he refused to have an independent inquiry. And even to this day, we've never had an independent inquiry into what took place. So yeah, absolutely, there's so much there that was hidden. The way the police operated, many cases they went into Sikh neighborhoods before the mobs arrived, confiscated their firearms, licensed firearms and karbans, and then allowed the mobs to come in and kill people. In many areas, they sought out Sikhs who were hiding and brought them out for the mobs to kill them. So, there's lots of, and a lot of the police have actually admitted to this. There was a sting operation a few years ago, particularly of the policemen in East Delhi, who admitted that they were part of this conspiracy to teach the Sikhs a lesson as part of the conspiracy of the ruling Congress Party at the time. So, and lots of other things that have never come out. The fact that a senior member of the Congress Party and a member of the family Gandhi family household, allegedly, in Arun Nehru MP, allegedly was the main orchestra of the genocide. We've got testimony to say that a few months before, he was part of an operation to collect the lists of Sikh homes and businesses from the Gurdwara of Delhi, and those lists were then handed over to the mobs. And the strategy, in his words, was to get hold of Sikh youth, put a tie around him, put kerosene in the tie and burn him alive to quote, temper the anger of the Hindus. So, all these kind of events can be traced back to a small clique of congressmen, senior Congress leaders at the time, who were hell-bent on scapegoating Sikhs as a minority in order for the Congress to capture the Hindu vote.
Yeah, it's I always struggle. I always struggle hearing about some of the accounts and things like that, because there's graphic images that take place, there's video evidence, there's I think one of the most striking things is the eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony can pick out senior politicians that were present, people like, I'm not sure if we're allowed to say the name, but Jagdish Titler, people like that, who can be picked out of a lineup to say that he was there, and to this day nothing's happened, and they have been promoted to positions of even greater influence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are talking about very powerful politicians. Politicians like Jagdish Titler, who would probably have ended up becoming prime ministers. And it even goes above him. I mean, the Home Minister, Narasimha Rao, who could have brought out the army, and even above him, Rajiv Gandhi, who did nothing for 3 days when the violence took place, when politicians were pleading to him to bring out the army to save people, and he did nothing. These are powerful politicians, and they've got away with mass murder. It's as simple as that. So they still got away with that mass murder.
Yeah, there was even just when we talk about sort of like groundswell and like the sort of mood of the public at the time. I boycott Bollywood. One of its biggest stars in Amitabh Bachchan. The Khoon Ka Badla Khoon, that speech was. It's chilling when you hear about these people who are pillars of communities and international communities, because Bollywood's an international industry. I mean, it's chilling to capture the sort of mood at the time.
Yeah, it was. It was very communal mood at the time, even before 1984, but particularly after the genocide. There were cases of Sikhs being attacked. Carried on being attacked after November 1984. Sikh kids at schools being bullied. Jokes were made of them, and so forth. So it was a general sort of anti-Sikh sentiment that took place. And shamefully, the government then decided to have elections in December 1984, just a month after the genocide, to kind of try and capture that mood, to capture that Hindu vote, and they got the biggest mandate, the biggest majority of any ruling party. And it was those Congress leaders who were involved in the massacres, people like H.K.L. Bhagat in East Delhi, who got the largest majority. So in a way, the Indian public gave tacit support to what took place by giving a mandate to the very killers of Sikhs. So that's a sort of time, and not only, and 2 or 3 decades after that, that's the kind of life Sikhs have to live under outside Punjab. In Punjab is a different story. In Punjab, that was a police state, and it remained a police state for a whole decade afterwards, where many human rights abuses took place, torture, rape of Sikhs, anyone who even was accused of being part of the militant group. The whole family was was taken out and disappeared. So that, you know, the story of Punjab from 1984 to probably 1994 is a whole different story of disappeared, mass cremations as well. It's not just what took place in November.
So what was so you have the assassination of Indira Gandhi, you have the pogroms sort of go on throughout November. What was going on in Punjab at the time following that over the months and years?
So following November 84, you know, people expected a backlash to happen in Punjab of Sikhs against Hindus, and it did not happen. It did not materialize at all. No Hindu was killed following November 84 in a concerted, you know, large scale organized effort. Of course, there were militant groups in Punjab, and some of them were communal, and there were attacks on innocent Hindus, and you know, those acts should be condemned. There was the downing of the Air India flight as well in 1985. You know, of involvement of one Khalistani group, and one of them was brought to justice. So you know, it's very important not to whitewash what took place on supposedly our side. I think, you know, any acts of terrorism, killings of innocents should be condemned by all, and I don't think any Sikh would condone attacks on innocents. I think it goes against what we believe in
100%,
anyway.
yeah.
So it's very important to sort of look at that side things as well. I think it's, you know, important to actually talk maybe about the secessionist movement as well afterwards, and whether that was the best option for Sikhs. I mean, I still believe in an India that should be secular, pluralistic. I don't think that exists anymore. I think with the advent of, you know, the Hindu chauvinist and Hindutva movement that's took place now, India is fast becoming a Hindu country. But you know, I still cling on the fact that it has an Indian secular constitution, and you know, I will always fight for India to be secular, and for everyone. So you know, I think Sikhs, you know, since independence and even before that, have fought for this India, you know, through sacrifices, being part of the independence movement and so forth. So we should never be forced to sort of separate.
You mentioned that you mentioned that sort of India is becoming more sort of Hindu nationalist and stuff. How is that the case? How is that happening now?
So, although, you know, the BJP came into power, you know, in majority 2014 or so, it really started in 1984. I mean, I listened to lots of liberal members of Congress these days who've said that, you know, the movement of Hindutva started in 1984 in 2014 with the advent of the BJP. But I don't you know, agree with that. I think it happened in 1984. I think the genie of Hindu nationalism was opened in 1984 with the Congress Party, and then the BJP just took that on. The BJP is just blatant Hindu chauvinist. The Congress and the Liberals kind of hide it. They're the pseudo-liberalists. And even to this day, they refuse to engage with 84 and their part, or their Congress Party's part in what took place, because they kind of paint themselves as secular, forward-looking progressive. But, you know, as a kind of a amnesia when it comes to 1984 to them. But yeah, you know, once the BJP had gotten in, then obviously lots of textbooks just started changing. You know, a real kind of move towards being, what does India mean? You know, it's more to do with going back to the kind of Hindu mythological era, and for them, every Indian is a Hindu, and should subscribe to Hinduism.
Mm.
And even the Sikh, the constitution is refers to Sikhs as Hindus, so that still hasn't been ratified as well, and it hasn't changed. So yeah, it is quite challenging at the moment for minorities, and also low caste Hindus as well. You know, it's a government that's made up of high caste Hindus, businessmen, and the
Yeah.
corporates, and that's where we've ended up. Completely different from where I think those who fought for Indian independence fought for. They didn't fight for, you know, this kind of a mirror image of Pakistan. You know,
Yeah.
where on Pakistan's side you've got the rise of Islamism, and you know the official religion of the state is Islam, and then on India side that's where it's going, and it's a real shame because many of us, you know, believe in the idea of India as a secular, pluralistic country, and it's a real shame that it's going away from that.
Yeah, I almost feel like divisions are just sort of like when we talk about politics in general, I almost feel like divisions are part and parcel of strategy almost. You know, the more divided you get, the more you can secure, like the more you can divide groups and societies into like little communities, the sort of more secure your power bases are. And I think the thing that's always missed from what happened in 1984 is the sort of politics that were at play. Like even though the people committing these atrocities were, you know, either soldiers carrying out orders, or, you know, actual smaller sort of like community clusters, everybody was essentially played on like a bigger platform, which was securing power and securing a popular base. And we are seeing that now. So you sort of see the Kisan Morscha that's going on, so the farmers protest at the moment. But then you also can like link what happened in Punjab and also in Delhi at the time to other communities. So like, for example, the Muslims in Gujarat, and even the sort of Tamils down in the south. So that's always been something that I think is like key. I don't think it's just ever been like a Sikh issue. I think it's always been a minority issue in India.
Yeah, absolutely, and also interstate relationships as well. So, you know, once independence had happened, there was a real sort of urge of the state, the center, to introduce Hindi in the whole of India. And many of the states, including Punjab, but also the states in South India, who rebelled against the imposition of Hindi. So there was kind of regional movements for their own language, and that happened in Punjab as well. Movements to have their own state rights as well. So it's not just a Punjab issue, and you can see that now with the Kisans. Kisans are everywhere in India. But I think in particular in the Punjab state situation, Punjab was the last state to be recognised as a state, and even then it was carved up, with Haryana and Himachal being created after out of a larger Punjab, to create that Punjab Suba. But even that Punjab Suba wasn't, you know, many of the areas Punjabi speaking were left out, and then it was decided to just give them a shared capital as well. And then they started, you know, taking the water rights away from them, which again impacted farmers.
So I think we've kind of touched on this point, but in your view, obviously somebody who's got extensive knowledge about what's going on, and you've covered sort of the history of it, what's the reasoning behind this? Because technically, even if they like with Punjab, let's say, even if it's a sort of separate and like a separate entity, at the end of the day, they are technically Indian citizens. So what's the motives behind sort of stripping away rights and land and things like that?
I think you've nailed it by saying divide and rule. They follow the policy of the British. So the British were really good at dividing and ruling, dividing communities and ruling, and the Indian ruling class have taken that to its end by introducing genocide in order to divide communities. It's the way the powerful do. I mean, the Indian ruling class is made up of industrialists and capitalists. They're not made up of ordinary people, whether they're working on the land or working in factories. They're a pseudo-capitalist country, and will fight to the end to maintain that sort of unequal type of government and society, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The rich and the powerful can get away with murder. They can use bribery. They use their contacts to evade justice, and that's the sort of society that we're in at the moment. We've got those societies everywhere in the world as well. Some quite extreme, where you look at some of the totalitarian countries like North Korea, Iran, and so forth. But you also have democracies now going towards that, and have been the last few years. And probably the USA is probably a prime example of what we've been going through the last few years with Trump. Again, the policy of divide and rule. So with his base, it has divided and introduced lots of toxicity in politics and in society in America. So it's not something that's unique to India. It's happened everywhere, really. But the good thing is that the people are many, they are the few, and it's when the people rise and start fighting for their rights that you can change things for the better. And I think it's really heartening that that movement has started with the Kisans, the farmers. So I'm hoping that movement, is then joined by other groups, and they start challenging what kind of India it's become, and what they should be, what kind of India they want their children to live in.
Do you sort of have any fears or anything about what's going on here at the moment? So on Twitter, I think it was a former Supreme Court justice recently sort of tweeted out. I mean, I think he left very room for interpretation, but essentially what I think he was sort of alluding to was that a massacre on the scale of like Jallianwala Bagh under the British was necessary or forthcoming. Do you have any sort of reservations or like worries that this movement could see the same form of suppression that we saw in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, it could do, absolutely. You can see the signs of that, the way the government is painting the movement, the farmers' movement, as a secessionist, terrorist. They started off with calling them Khalistani, and then they changed it to terrorists and so forth, and anti-national. So you can see how they're framing it. I don't think it's working at the moment, because there is so much support for the farmers throughout India by so many people of all faiths. It's probably a good thing in terms of social media. We didn't have social media in 1984. Now we do. So we see the events live now, and everything is shared. So that's probably a good thing. It's very difficult for the state to hide things now, where they did in 1984. The other thing about 84 is that they had control of the media, the state media. So the state TV, Doordarshan, was owned by the state, and also the radio as well. So we're not in that situation now, but then they will clamp on the media. It's not that difficult for them to, as China does from time to time, close down social media and control, censor media, which they've done in 84 again. They were censoring newspapers. Very few newspapers talked about the genocide. In fact, there's only one who talked about massacres, the Indian Express, but even they didn't talk about the rapes. They refused to even mention that. But the whole of the rest of the media told the Indian government line that this was just a minimal loss of life that took place, and they were just talking about hundreds of people who were killed. yeah, we know now there were thousands, and only in Delhi, but throughout northern India. So many of the cities of northern India, villages, towns, and also, in between towns on the buses and trains, they were attacked as well in an organized way. It wasn't spontaneous. Many of those areas, there were concerted operations that took place, train stoppages, unauthorized, going into the 50 or 60 stoppages where mobs can go in. So a real control of what took place. And I think that can still happen. But again, I think it's up to the people to make sure that that everything's shared and everything's transparent, and people in the wider world knows what's taking place on the ground.
Yeah, I also I sort of hark back to sort of the early days of the farmers' protests at the moment, where almost within days it kind of went viral. As soon as it looked like the sort of police were being heavy-handed, and roadblocks were being water cannons. There was that iconic image of the sort of Baba, the elderly gentleman, being hit with a stick. And I think I was very fearful in that point. Had the movement not gone as viral as it did, celebrities tweeting about it, that kind of stuff. Had it not gone viral at that point, then I think we would be looking at a very different picture here at the moment. But
yeah, I agree. But there's also the other iconic scene of the guy who got on top of one of the water cannons,
yeah,
and shut it down right in front of the police, and that was really good, because that actually showed, although the state will try and attack you with batons, the reaction is people's power. There is a power amongst the many who can change things, and I think that's really important to say. That's where our optimism, Chadgikala come from. We can change things if we all unite together. So I think there's an optimism there as well.
Yeah. So going back to sort of Punjab after the sort of one of the things that I'm always fascinated by when it comes to this movement is what ended up happening in Punjab in the sort of 80s and 90s. Now, we touched on it sort of earlier in the conversation, but what specific policies and tactics did the sort of central and also local governments start using?
So I think after what took place in November, I mean, there was no secret in Punjab what took place. I mean, tens of thousands of Sikhs in Delhi and northern India had to escape, and they escaped to Punjab and also to the West. And so those stories were spread between families of what took place, the killings and rapes, and there was a real anger in Punjab of what took place, and that then encouraged a secessionist movement, a militant movement for Khalistan. So I think the Indian state got really worried about that, because there was a real feeling. And also, if you look at the stats, I mean, I think it was 1986, there was elections in Punjab, 86, 87, and the majority of the candidates supported Khalistan. There was a general popular feeling in Punjab that, enough was enough. What took place in 84, you couldn't just let it go and forget about it. So there was a real popular feeling that change needs to be made. I think the Indian state basically, in reaction to that, came in really hard against the movement. And that's why you got so many people disappeared, so many killings and rapes, so forth. And
Just to
many of
interrupt
the
there.
Punjab police was involved as well. Yeah.
So yeah, just to interrupt there. So obviously you mentioned the phrase sort of disappeared. What does that look like on the ground? What is that in actuality during that time?
So people will be taken from their house in the middle of the night, taken to a police station and executed. And then their body would be thrown maybe into the canal. And then the next day, there'll be a media story leaked by the police to say there was an encounter, so-called encounter, a shootout between themselves and the militant. The militant got killed, where in actual fact it was an execution. So
Yeah.
so many stories, well documented by human rights groups on the ground, of many families where their loved ones were killed in that way.
Yeah, I think the estimates are always the sort of thing that's bring that into reality for me. I mean, you see estimates that go close to somewhere like 250,000 people were, obviously there's no official figure for it because they weren't counted for. But like 250,000 people being disappeared, like if you think about just the sort of astronomical scale of that, I think it's chilling, isn't it? Now, this was a question I was going to save to the end, right? But I'm going to ask it now because I think we've kind of led onto it quite well. But obviously, there's the story of Jaswant Singh Khalra, who was a human rights activist over from Canada, collated a report, started actually carrying out analysis of what was going on, and found these sort of mass cremation sites and had proof and evidence of this. In, I think it was 92, was it? I think it was 92. He takes a trip back to Punjab and obviously gets picked up. Eyewitness accounts say that he got picked up by the police and disappeared. Now, now obviously the work's not quite compatible, but I mean, obviously you're drawing quite a lot of media attention with your book, with your actual analysis and things like that, onto the topic of a genocide and the roles played by certain powerful key individuals. Do you ever like sort of think or worry? Does your mind ever wander onto like, do you face any danger? Say if you were to go back to India, would you kind of be looking over your shoulder a little bit?
I don't think so. I think the situation has changed in India. I mean, I probably would have done a decade ago. And particularly if the Congress Party was in power, I don't think my book would have been published in India. No way, it definitely would have been banned. So I think, 3 decades on from the genocide, many ordinary people in India are very supportive of the cause of justice, of all faiths. So I think the situation is different in that sense. There have been stories, and obviously there's a famous story of one of our Scottish guys who's been taken into custody and is still in prison and hasn't been brought to justice, and so forth. There are isolated cases, but I think generally this story of the genocide of November '84, many people do know about it and they do want to fight for that. So I think it's slightly different. So see, my job is to actually engage with people, ordinary Indians, to actually look at this and start asking questions. Particularly those who, particularly Hindus who've sort of maybe don't know much about what happened. I mean, I had a talk recently with a Hindu academic, and he was saying, my generation don't know anything about what took place. We're not taught this in schools, and even the media don't frame it the way you framed it. And he was shocked to learn these testimonies that I'd collated. So I think I think a lot of work needs to be done still about engaging with people on this topic. And I think through that, I think we can then start, getting the powers to be look at this again. And that's why at the end I do call for an independent Truth and Reconciliation Commission to really look at the events, call out people, call out the Congress Party to recognise what took place on their watch, and also bring in help to the victims, trauma specialists for the people who are traumatized by the events, rape counselors. So all these things I'm pushing for, but an independent inquiry, truth and reconciliation on par with what's happening in South Africa is required now. but it needs to be led by the victims this time around, not by the government. And I think that's the only way we can start the process of closure.
You sort of speak about testimonies there. What kind? I guess this is a two-part testimony. Question. Firstly, what were the testimonies like? What kind of stories did you hear when you were collating the sort of data? And secondly, what was that like for you? Obviously, somebody with a shared heritage with the people who had experienced this. What was that like personally for you?
Well, the testimonies were pretty horrific. Some of the testimonies in the first inquiry that were then hidden for years talked in particular not just the way the Congress and leaders incited mobs, but many of the testimonies talked about ordinary neighbors who turned upon them. So there was many, some localities, Hindus saved Sikhs, but other localities, Hindus turned upon their Sikh neighbors. So there was a lot of stories that I was quite shocked with. It seems as if a lot of ordinary neighbors took it upon themselves to cut Sikhs down to size, take their homes, take their land and their possessions. So I was quite shocked with that. But the kind of gruesome, stories that I've had to sort of talk about in the book were horrific. And yeah, it did, it's quite difficult to read at the time. And the way I dealt with it is, as I explained at the beginning, I do lots of running. I do triathlons and I live in the countryside. So I kind of, I would, do a run in the day and get away from these stories and sort of calm my mind, my mental state. I think if I didn't do that, it would have really eaten me up. So that was the only way I could sort of write about these things. And the book was 10 years in the making, but it took a couple of years to actually write it down. But yeah, it was difficult, but I could try and manage it. And now that I've got it published and out there, it's out there, it belongs to the readers, not me. So it's a real weight off my shoulder now.
With one thing that you go on to touch in the book, India's Guilty Secret, was the role that sort of foreign parties played in the sort of post event, if you like, agencies like Britain, places like that, because obviously at that time the sort of diaspora community was sizable. So you did have Punjabis and especially Sikhs in the US, UK, Canada, and places like that. But what role did sort of foreign powers play at the time?
Yeah, so in particular Britain, because obviously Britain had a long-standing relationship with India, being the former colonial power, very close relationship with India. In particular, the British government had eyes on the Indian market, the growing new Indian market, and wanted to make deals with Indian goods, wanted to sell arms to India. The famous Westland helicopter deals was taking place in the 80s as well. So on the one hand, they had to deal with India and be very cozy to India and India industrialists, but on the other hand, they had Sikh minorities and diaspora, who they saw as a nuisance, really, because here these Sikhs talking about 84 and genocide, and they really didn't like that. So they took the side of India. They were very indifferent to sort of the claims of India, of Sikhs at the time. And I think it did cause a lot of problems. I think even to this day, we don't have an Indian, a British, leading government who's condemned what took place in November 1984. Even our opposition leader has never actually condemned what took place in 84 and called out that genocide. Both Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson have not condemned the genocide of November 1984, and that's another thing that I'll be calling for later on this year is they should, as they've done with other smaller genocides like Srebrenica genocide, where they've recognised that mass crime, they should also do that with November 1984.
After having written the book, and obviously it's probably one of the most popular books on the actual subject of the 84 genocide, have you, and obviously you've got an online presence and things like that as well, have you received any backlash or anything around what you've written and collated?
No, I haven't actually, and it's, you know, it's been warmly received in India. I mean, I've got many messages from particularly non-Sikhs who just didn't realize what took place, the extent, and they say that it's opened their eyes. I'm quite heartened with that, because that was my main aim, really, to sort of open people's eyes and start asking them to ask questions about what took place and look at the events. So my objective was to do that and get this story out to as many people as possible, not only in India, but to the West as well. And that's one of the reasons why I have two publishers. So one in the West, Kashi House. So, you know, it's been widely read in the West, Canada, America, and here in Britain, Australia, but also in India as well, where I have Rupa, one of the top publishers in India, who'd been brilliant. You know, very few publishers in India wanted to touch this, and they one of the ones that said, no, we want this. We know that this is a very important work and needs to be come out. I think that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been a backlash, because, you know, that you can't argue against something that's very evidence-based, based on testimonies from the very families that were involved. It's very hard to anyone to argue against that. I think that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been a backlash.
Right. Yeah, that kind of makes sense, and I think that I think what you just said there about the sort of evidence-based sort of empirical approach, I think that's kind of what I think separated the book out from a lot of other books and pieces of text on the topic. With regards to, and you touched on this earlier, but with regards to reconciliation and how do you sort of move forwards towards something that like kind of looks not a rosy future, but, you know, like a sort of future where healing and reconciliation can take place, what steps need to be sort of carried out both in India and also sort of with the diaspora?
I think in terms of India, you know, I'm calling for the Indian government to allow for an independent Truth and Reconciliation Commission to take place. Now that, you know, we've had it in South Africa, we've had it in many countries in South America, and also in Bosnia and Rwanda. So I think Indian government can do that. They can allow that to happen. I think once that's done, you know, we can have the victims' organizations, their lawyers, to be involved to actually direct that. So really to scope that, what kind of inquiry that would mean. So obviously on the justice side, yes, we need the truth out so we can bring justice and call people to account. It will also allow a lot of people who know the truth. So for example, the mechanism of the genocide, so who ordered the kerosene, who ordered the weaponry, the phosphorus white powder that, you know, burnt people to the bone, you know, that these things, chemicals, are not readily available. They was an organized way they were procured and given to mobs who, you know, allowed the stoppages of the trains to happen, who told the police not to do anything or be actively involved in the pogroms, who cover up the whole genocide for 3 decades, you know, the judiciary, and allowed those involved to evade justice. There's a lot of people out there who know the truth in the administration bureaucracy. This would allow them to actually hopefully come out and tell us the truth, and maybe even offer some amnesty to those people who may not have been involved in the killings, but know who were involved, who, you know, who organized these things. So that's one way to do that, and also allows the victims to actually ask for help. So a lot of the communities in, you know, the widows communities need help, they need empowerment, they need proper jobs They need proper education for their kids and the grandchildren as well. So there's a lot that could be done in terms of that. And I've also talked about help in terms of, mental help and trauma help as well. So I think this is a process that will start with just a state to recognize what had been done and recognize it as a genocide. And then from then onwards, the victims can lead that, healing and eventual closure. But it has to start now, because this is an open wound, not just for Sikhs, but also for India as a secular state. It's a real kind of stain on India that really we need to resolve. And all Indians and all people in diaspora need to help in this process and not brush it aside. It's gone for far too long.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I guess my final question to you would kind of be a more conceptual question, I guess, in that, can India still class itself as a democracy? Given what we spoke about, sort of what happened with Juggy, a British UK Scottish citizen being held without trial, without evidence, without due process, really, for nearly close to 1,200 days. What needs to take place for India to sort of rectify that and sort of, as you sort of put it, sort of to expose the guilty secret and get rid of it? Why has that not taken place, and can it still call itself a democracy, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's problematic to call it a democracy where, the state, the police, the law enforcers, are law upon themselves. They use torture on a daily basis, and minority rights are always attacked. The position of women as well, in cases of rape as well, it's ongoing. So there's lots of problems India needs to address. I think it's about recognizing, these crimes. And it may not happen, and it probably won't happen in this administration, but I'm looking at future administrations. A progressive in administration. Where in the West we're used to, supposedly progressive governments. You look at ourselves, but also Canada, and I'm hoping the new Biden administration's coming in America, where you see it as more progressive, more transparent, more open. That's the sort of government that I wish a future Indian government would be, where it actually holds up their arms and say, look, we made a gigantic mistake in terms of 1984 and subsequent massacres that took place, and we need to change. And I think that the way the government will change is by pressure from below. And that's the only way people in power will change. So again, going back to Kisan movement at the moment, that's a really good, encouraging way the government of India will take stock. But I'm looking at future administration. I can't see it happening in the near future.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Pav. Really enjoyed our chat. The book, I really encourage any of our listeners to go get it. I mean, it's really good. Probably the foremost book, I think, on the matter, which was 1984, India's Guilty Secret. Pav, your social medias as well, what are those? I think you're quite active on Twitter.
Yeah, it's mainly Twitter, actually. So yeah, you can find me on Twitter.
Pav Singh. At Pav Singh. Yeah.
1984, India's Guilty Secret.
Excellent. Thank you so much.